The movie starts with an illegal underground fight taking place. Then a woman named Frankie shows up. She's looking for a bouncer for her bar, but the guy she originally came to watch is getting badly beaten. But then our main character steps in. After winning 6 fights, the winner challenged the audience, and our main character accepts the challenge. His opponent thinks it'll be an easy win, but as soon as our hero takes off his shirt, the opponent gets intimidated and refuses to fight.
I don't give a fuck. I'm not. He said fuck.
Without even throwing a punch, our hero wins and collects the prize money. As he heads to his car, a thug, who had bet money on the fight, stabs him in the stomach and runs off. Just then, Frankie comes there and tells him that most fighters back off once they recognize him, which is why he hides his identity at first. But then she notices he's been stabbed and tries to call an ambulance. Instead, he just pours alcohol on the wound, tapes it up, and moves on. Then Frankie offers him a job. She owns a roadhouse down in the Florida Keys that's constantly being trashed by local thugs. The police don't help, and no bouncer has been able to stick around. So she offers him $5,000 for a week, plus free food and lodging to come work for her. But Dalton declines at first and Frankie leaves. As he's crossing the road, a train blocks his path. He parks his beloved car right on the tracks without realizing it. When he sees the train coming, he desperately tries to start his old junker, but it won't budge. The train smashes into the car, but holding tight to the steering wheel, our hero somehow walks away without a scratch. Now homeless, he rethinks Frankie's offer and decides to head to Florida. On his way, he meets a woman named Charlie who runs a bookstore. She lends him a book for free and asks what he's doing in town. So Dalton explains he's there to help the owner of the roadhouse. Then Charlie's father shows up and points him toward the bar, and Dalton tries to pay for the book, but they refuse, and he sets off on foot to find the roadhouse. After walking a little further, Dalton spots the roadhouse sign. As he steps inside, Frankie notices him. Then Dalton asks a bartender for a coffee, and a worker, Billy, immediately recognizes Dalton and tells him he's a huge fan. Then night begins, and a group of rowdy bikers storms in and starts trashing the place, and Dalton notices Frankie standing upstairs, quietly observing everything. When one of the bikers, Dell, harasses a waitress, Dalton steps in, and he tells Billy to move aside. At first, Dell mocks Dalton, but he calmly asks if the motorcycle parked outside is theirs. When they confirm, Dalton heads for the door, and they follow him. But outside, Dalton tells them to just leave peacefully. Then Dalton double-checks if everyone has insurance and even asks Frankie how far the nearest hospital is. After confirming all information, Dalton beats up the bikers with a few well-placed slaps and punches. He jokingly suggests to Dell that they call it a draw, meaning no one really wins or loses. But when they resist, Dalton easily takes them down again. Then Dalton asks Frankie for her car and loads the injured bikers into it to take them to the hospital. At the reception desk, a nurse asks if they're his friends. Dalton says, "No, I'm the one who beat them up." That's when Ellie, a doctor, appears. She jokingly thanks Dalton for bringing in new patients, but then she accuses him of fighting for fun. But Dalton says, no, he fights for money. Then Ellie notices a wound on Dalton's stomach and insists on treating it. After cleaning it up and bandaging it, he goes to the bar. Then Frankie gives Dalton his first week's pay as promised. She suggests he get a room at a nearby hotel, but Dalton notices a boat parked at the beach and asks about it. Frankie says it's theirs, though it's not seaworthy, and warns him there's a dangerous alligator nearby. But Dalton decides to stay there anyway, cleans up the old boat cabin and moves in with his few belongings. While Dalton is settling into the old boat, local man warns him again to watch out for the alligator nearby. That night, Dalton dreams about fighting, and it's clear the brawls are always on his mind. In the morning, Laura, the bartender from the roadhouse, comes by to wake him up. She tells Dalton to think of her like a sister and brings him a special homemade meal. And she also says that many bouncers came before him, but none of them lasted long, and she was planning to quit too. But now that Dalton's around, she feels she might be able to stay. Now we meet Brian, the boss of those thugs. He's furious that his guys got beaten up by one man, and one thug explained that the new bouncer was polite at first, but then took them down without breaking a sweat. At the bar, a drunk customer starts cursing and picking fights because he doesn't like the song playing. So Dalton calmly tells Billy to be careful, because the man in the red shirt has a knife. And Dalton instructs Billy to step back when the knife comes out and hit him hard. And when the red shirt guy pulls a knife, Billy steps back and knocks him out with a punch. Then Dalton disarms the man and throws him out of the bar. Doing this, Dalton was not only keeping the peace, but also teaching Billy some fighting moves, which Billy used almost every night. Later that night, the same group of thugs shows up again, but seeing Dalton, they immediately turn around and leave without causing trouble. The next day, Dr. Ellie, the woman who had treated Dalton, visits the roadhouse. She sits with Dalton, and a little romantic tension starts to build between them, but nothing happened. After finishing his shift one night, Dalton is on his way back when Dell, one of the thugs, tries to ram him with his car, and Dell manages to push Dalton into the heaven. But Dalton survives and makes it back to his boat, only to find Dell waiting for him inside and aiming a gun. Just as Dell is about to shoot, Dalton grabs him and throws him out of the boat. But Dell falls into the water, and right then, an alligator attacks, and Dalton tries to pull him out, but the alligator gets Dell and drags him under. The next morning, police search the water for Dell and the alligator, but find neither. Later, as Dalton steps out of Charlie's bookstore, another thug pulls a gun on him, ordering him to come along. And he also says that Brian, their boss, wants to see him. But Dalton refuses, telling thugs he isn't in the mood. When they tries to threaten him with the gun, Dalton casually breaks his 2 fingers. Another thug shows up, and Dalton tells him to carry his partner to the car and inform Brian that if he wants a meeting, he'll have to come to the roadhouse himself. Back at the roadhouse, Frankie meets Dalton and says she knows she shouldn't be happy about Dell's death, but she is. Because Dell had been harassing her for months, and Dalton asks why Dell was targeting her. But Frankie admits she doesn't know. Could be possible that they just love making trouble. Meanwhile, Brian Mann reports back to Brian, telling him that Dalton broke his fingers and stole his gun. After this report, Brian is filled with anger. At that moment, Brian gets a call from his father, who yells at him, calling him fool, and enraged Brian throws his phone into the water. Meanwhile, we're introduced to Knox, a tough, street-smart fighter who also works for Brian's father. Then Brian's father tells Knox over the phone that Brian has messed up big time and orders him to come to Florida immediately. The next morning, Ellie visits Dalton by boat. She tells him it belongs to her boyfriend, who's a cop. Then she takes Dalton out into the open sea, where they anchor and relax. When Ellie starts asking Dalton personal questions, he becomes distant and asks to head back. And he tells her, "You're a good person, but I'm not." Ellie says he's no ordinary man, he's famous, and she knows everything about him. Meanwhile, Knox arrives in Florida and heads straight to Brian's hideout. Then he immediately starts picking fights with Brian's men. And when Brian arrives, he asks Knox who he is. But Knox punches him in the face and says, "Your dad sent this punch." And he announces he'll be staying here, but Brian tells him to go back and inform his father that everything is under control, and he doesn't need help. So, Knox gives him one chance to destroy Roadhouse. Back with Dalton, Ellie drops him off at his boat, but 2 cops show up and tell him that he has to come with them. But Ellie watches all this from a distance. Then police take Dalton to the sheriff. Then he comes in car and tells Dalton to leave the city. But Dalton calmly replies, no. So Sheriff warns Dalton that if he doesn't leave, he might get stabbed in jail and regret for not listening. But Dalton retorts he doesn't scare of anyone. The officers drag Dalton out and beat him up, and even pulls a gun on him until Ellie arrives and slaps the sheriff across the face. Then, on the way out, Ellie tells Dalton the sheriff is her father. He's working under orders from Brian's powerful father, who has a lot of money invested in the town, but he is currently in jail. And she urges Dalton to leave the city for his own safety. Later that night, while Dalton is on duty at the bar, Brian shows up and Dalton asks if he's there to threaten him. But Brian replies,
"No, I get the impression that you can't be threatened. I wish you could be."
Then he shows Dalton a video on his phone. In this video, Dalton was fighting with his friend in a fight, and even his friend had given up. Dalton doesn't stop and kills him. So Brian asks, "Why didn't you stop and why did you keep going?" But Dalton remains silent, and Brian leaves without another word. Then, outside the roadhouse, Dalton walks up to Knox and says, "Do whatever you want." So 7 Knox turns to his gang and they all enter the bar. And Knox begins trashing the place, and Dalton just sits and watches quietly. But Knox tells the elderly band to stop singing, but they refuse. And when Billy and Rafe try to stop him, Knox beats them up easily, because he was a one-man wrecking crew. And his aggression riles up the bar patrons, leading to a full-on brawl between the locals and Knox's goons. And the place is torn apart, and Dalton remains seated. Finally, Knox calls him out, and Dalton gets up and walks toward him. Then, Knox promises to beat him in front of everyone to teach him a lesson. They start fighting. Knox viciously beats Dalton, but Dalton barely reacts, like it's as if he's allowing it. Then Knox drags Dalton outside while Ellie arrives and asks her boyfriend, who is a cop, and tell him to send backup. When cops come there, she checks on Dalton and asks if he's okay, but he walks away in silence. Despite all the chaos, the elderly musicians never stopped singing. Later, Dalton begins packing his things on his boat to leave the town. But Frankie shows up and confesses the truth that Brian's father wants to take her roadhouse away, because he owns the land around it and wants to demolish the bar to build a luxury resort, and she don't want to sell. But Dalton, frustrated, replies to don't sell it. but leave him out of it. She accuses him of running away in fear. So he replies, "You have no idea how scared I really am." Then Dalton goes to the bus stop near Charlie's bookstore, only to find burned to the ground. He learns Charlie and her father have been taken to the hospital, but in the process, he misses his bus. And fueled by rage, Dalton heads to Brian's hideout. He finds Vince, who smugly asks if Dalton got their message, and Dalton says, "I was already leaving." Just then, Vince tries to stab him, but Dalton quickly breaks his neck with a single punch, and now he is dead. Dalton then drags the body to a truck, but one of Brian's henchmen standing nearby and says, "I'm leaving town too, boss. I only joined this gang to ride bikes." Then Dalton asks where Brian is. The guy says he overheard that Brian has a big meeting at 5 a.m. to arrange funding for some business. Then he says,
Good luck with the guy.
Then Dalton hides Vince's body in a cooler full of ice on his boat. And the next morning, when a police officer shows up carrying a bag full of cash after the meeting of Brian, then Dalton quietly follows him and knocks him out and hides the money. Then he sets the boat adrift into the ocean with Vince's body and fires multiple shots at the body using the officer's gun. But injured cop regains consciousness and asks, "Why are you doing all this?" So Dalton replies, "I wasn't thinking straight last night and I was angry. The cop warns that I'm going to tell everyone what you did." But Dalton calmly picks up a stick and says, "Well, I doubt you'll remember much of this in the morning," and violently strikes him in the head. Later, while Dalton is on his boat, then Sheriff shows up in a panic and says that Brian's kidnapped my daughter and he is demanding ransom. But Dalton says, "I don't have the money." Then Sheriff responds, "That wounded cop told me everything. You have the cash, but Brian thinks I have it because I sent my man to deliver it. Please just get my daughter back." Then Dalton asks where to deliver the money, then he steals Ellie's boyfriend's boat. When the cop tries to stop him, Dalton says, "The sheriff asked me to take it." Then cop warns, "If there's even a scratch on my boat, I'll ruin you." So Dalton quips that, "It's a boat. How do you scratch something in water?" Meanwhile, Knox is heading to Brian's hideout, but he's terrible at braking. By the time he gets there, everyone's already gone, because they've all joined Brian on his boat. Then Dalton also arrives and is escorted to Brian Mann, and Sheriff is already there. Then Brian demands that, "Where's all my money?" But Dalton smirks, looking at the sheriff, and he doesn't seem like his daughter's really kidnapped. Then Sheriff confesses that, "I lied to you because she's fine." So Dalton realizes he's been played. But then Brian says, "That was my lie. I have kidnapped Ellie." Now double-crossed Sheriff loses it and draws his gun, but Brian forces him to sit down, and Brian threatens, "Hand over the money and take your girl." Suddenly they all notice another boat approaching, because Knox is also on board. So Brian shouts, "Don't let that lunatic get on this boat." Then Dalton grins and says, "Now I'm about to do something that'll really piss off a cop." He then hits a trigger and blows up the cop's boat in a massive explosion. And the blast is so powerful that everyone on Brian's boat is injured or thrown around in chaos. Then Dalton goes to find Ellie. She was locked in the cabin trying to break the glass to escape. Just then Dalton breaks down the door and enters. At the same moment, the glass shatters and suddenly high-pressure water floods into the boat. Then Dalton and Ellie quickly get out of the boat, but Brian pulls Ellie onto his boat and speeds away. But Knox tries to attack Dalton, but Dalton climbs onto his boat and throws him overboard. Then Knox grabs the rope tied to the boat, but Brian sees Dalton coming and turns his boat to collide with him. When the boats crash, Dalton jumps onto Brian's boat, and the fight begins. But the speed of the boat is so high that it's about to crash into a building. At the last moment, Ellie and Dalton jump off, and the boat crashes onto the roof of the roadhouse. Meanwhile, Knox reaches the bridge over the water, then hijacks a car and drives off. Here, Dalton searches for Brian, but Brian attacks him with a fishing gun. Filled with anger, Moulton starts beating Brian. Then Knox arrives, and a fierce fight breaks out between them. Both of them are skilled MMA fighters, but Dalton locks Knox in a tight chokehold and doesn't let go. In a last-ditch attempt, Knox stabs Dalton with a sharp stick. But just as Brian tells Knox to finish the job, Knox's own skull ends up being cracked by his own move. Then Dalton takes the sharp stick from Knox and strikes him 10 times with it, and Brian, seeing this, rushes in. But before he can attack, Sheriff arrives and tells Dalton to leave, assuring him that he'll take care of everything. Then Ellie also tells him to leave. The next day, the cleaning of the roadhouse begins, with Frankie and her team confident they can rebuild the place. Then Dalton sits at the bus stop in front of Charlie's bookshop, waiting for his bus. And Charlie arrives and asks, "Are you leaving for good?" Dalton replies, "Yeah, stories always end like this." Meanwhile, Charlie's dad finds a big suitcase full of money in the shop. When they come outside to meet Dalton, they see the bus already leaving. Then Billy asks Reef, "Where do you think our hero went?" But maybe even our hero didn't know the answer to that. And with that, the movie ends. If you enjoyed this movie, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can get more amazing movies like this. Until then, bye-bye.